Professor Mizumura Pence again, Thursday, April 13th. Welcome to another Zoom lecture for AMS 100. And these will also be available on YouTube. We've been doing that for a little while now. So I hope that we have a big audience for the synchronous version like we're doing now. But if you can't be with us right now, you have them on YouTube, okay? All right, so I'm going to share the screen. Open up the PowerPoint here. Okay. And let me move myself away a little bit here. Sort of. Okay. All right. So continuing with Module 4, Native Peoples, Mexico and Manifest Destiny. Thursday, April 13. Today's powerful words from Albert Schweitzer, who said, "I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I know, the only ones among you who will be really happy are those who will have sought and found how to serve." Good words. Always good to find a cause or causes to work on behalf of those. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so here's an image of Mexico and the United States before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So before the U.S. war with Mexico. So as you can see there, Mexico was much, much larger than it is now and occupied a significant portion of what is now in the United States. So the results of that war were quite drastic for both nations and the world, for that matter. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, I want to start off with a quotation here, and I realize that I'm jumping ahead with the reading a little bit. The reading assigned for today included an article on the U.S.-Mexican War by Richard Griswold del Castillo. I'm not going to refer a whole lot to that article. I hope that your discussion teachers will be able to spend some time with you on that. And I do think it's a pretty easily understood, brief, straightforward article. Very important, but in order to do what I want to do today, I need to work quite a bit with Ulysses S. Grant. So let me put out a quotation to start with, and this speaks to the very important relationships of white settlement and slavery in the 1800s to the U.S.-Mexican War. So from the memoir by former President Ulysses S. Grant, which he wrote after he served 2 terms as U.S. President, he made this very important claim. The occupation, separation, and annexation of Texas, I inserted of Texas there, he didn't spell it out there. He said these were from the inception of the movement to its final consummation, a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union. All right, so There you have Ulysses S. Grant condemning the annexation of Texas. And he's also referencing sectionalism there, which is an important concept. So annexation, sectionalism, and that takes us to next slide. Well, this was, sorry, quick image here of Ulysses S. Grant. He's on the left, and Lieutenant Alexander Hayes in 1845, and they were starting out for the Mexican War at that time. So you can't see Ulysses S. Grant too well there, but this was a photograph of him in his younger days, and he served with distinction in that war, even though he didn't like that the war was carried out. Next slide. Okay, so I promised at the end of lecture on Tuesday that I would address this question from a student, and it's an excellent question that came in when we met virtually on Tuesday. And here's the question from April 11th, 2023. The portion of Greenberg's chapter for today mentioned the term filibuster a few times. What is the difference between that term and annexation and sectionalism? Okay, I love the question. It shows, that the student read carefully and is looking out for those key terms. That helps all of us. I should say, before I jump into this, that there are multiple definitions of filibuster, and one definition has to do with procedures in U.S. Congress when a legislator, for example, will filibuster, i.e., talk for an extended amount of time to delay a vote on legislation that the person opposes. And sometimes this filibustering talk goes on. It could go on literally forever if it isn't stopped, okay? But this isn't the type of filibustering we're going to be talking about here. We're going to be talking about a specific type of filibustering that Greenberg deals with in her article and its relationship to manifest destiny. All right. And then we'll get to annexation and sectionalism. Next slide. Okay. So to begin to talk about filibuster and filibustering, we have an image here of perhaps the most well-known, famous, and infamous filibusterer, General William Walker, who was very active in Nicaragua in the 1800s. So he is, you can consider him perhaps the go-to individual to learn about the process of filibustering and the expansion of the United States during this period. Okay, next slide. Now, this is somebody, sorry, not next slide yet. This is someone who Greenberg talks about in the article, and rightly so. Next slide. Okay, so you're going to find this information on pages 26 to 29. And a filibusterer or filibustering, which is what someone that like William Walker did, these were adventurers who sought to carry out United States expansionism and territorial acquisition on their own without approval from official backup from the U.S. government. Now, this isn't to say that people powerful people in the US government didn't support people like William Walker, because they did, but they did it under the table, unofficially. Okay. So William Walker was what you might call a loose cannon. Again, yeah, he was perhaps the term adventurer is a polite term for what William Walker did, because one thing that Walker did in Nicaragua, and this ties into sectionalism, Walker established slavery in Nicaragua. And this appealed to the section of the United States in the South. Okay, so you had the northern section and the southern section, and they had conflicting interests in manifest destiny, especially regarding the expansion of slavery. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so in 1987, there was a movie made about William Walker called Walker, a fictionalized movie, very, very highly fictionalized. And the fact that it was produced in 1987, this is significant because at that time, the United States was militarily involved in Nicaragua. And this was very different in a lot of ways from what Walker was doing there. But the movie was seen as a commentary, not just on William Walker, but a commentary on US military involvement in Central America in general. There's been a lot of it. Okay. So the film was directed by Alex Cox. He made a couple of movies some of you might have seen and enjoyed or not enjoyed. One of them is called Repo Man, and another called Sid and Nancy, Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols and his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, both of whom died tragically. Alex Cox directed those movies along with Walker, and Joe Strummer, who was a guitarist and lead vocalist for the great rock and roll band The Clash, and who died in the early 2000s. He did the soundtrack for Walker. Okay, so a fictionalized version, again, critical of US involvement in Central America. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, sectionalism. Now, Greenberg talks a lot about this, pages 30, 31. So I need to quote from her. And she writes, divisions between the North and South exploded in the contest over the issue, slavery. And Northerners were no longer amenable to any territorial acquisition that might strengthen the South. The nation split along sectional lines over the Wilmot Proviso and remained split in the following years. Okay, so let's take a little closer look at the reading here, pages 30 to 31. All right, so and as she said, sectionalism checks manifest destiny. So the conflict over how much territorial expansion there would be, the conflict over whether slavery would be legal in newly acquired territories, this was sectionalism. So the northern section of the country, the southern section of the country had very different, very conflicted ideas over how manifest destiny was going to be carried out. So that slowed it down. And the US Civil War slowed it down even more. But manifest destiny reemerged and went further after the U.S. Civil War. Okay. The Wilmot Proviso, this is explained on pages 30 and 31 of Greenberg's article. So I'd encourage you to look into that more on your own, and once again, perhaps your discussion teachers will have a chance to go over it with you a little bit. Next slide. Okay, another young picture of U.S. Grant. I believe this is 1841. That looks almost like a 7 there, but I'd have to check. But it is Grant as a young man, as he served in that conflict. And sorry, my phone is ringing. That's not good. Let me turn that off. Okay. My bad. We'll go to the next slide. But yeah, Grant as he served, we won't go to the next slide quite yet. Sorry. Grant as he appeared around the time of the U.S.-Mexican War. And usually you see him with the heavy beard, like on the $50 bill. And I hope you have lots of those in your wallets. Okay. But he looks different here. Now, next slide. Okay. Annexation. Let's go to a dictionary definition here. Possession of a piece of land or a country, usually by force or without permission. So the United States annexed Texas, and Ulysses S. Grant didn't like that, and he wasn't alone. But we'd have to agree that his voice was a leading voice. As the commanding general of the Union forces during the U.S. Civil War and as an eventual U.S. president. The fact that Grant would speak out so forcefully against this shows how divided the country was. Next slide. All right, so let me give that a little attention here, and you will find this in the primary source. And there's Grant later on, as he looked when he was serving in the U.S. Civil War. And he mentions here that, in general, Army officers, they didn't really care whether Texas was annexed or not. But Grant said that he was bitterly opposed to this. He was very much against it. And he says, to this day, this, and speaking in the 1880s, he regards the war with Mexico, which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. So he did his duty as an Army officer. He fought in that war, but he was against it. Next slide. He went on to say that the United States should have been acting like a republic, but we weren't. The United States was following the bad example of European monarchies in not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. So, as I interpret this, it wasn't so much that Grant opposed acquiring additional territory, but he saw that this instance of it unjust and imperial, and we weren't supposed to be that way. Next slide. It's a famous image of Grant at the Battle of Monterrey, one of the major battles of the U.S. war in Mexico. And at one point, in order to obtain more ammunition for the U.S. forces, Grant had to ride on horseback through very heavy fire to get that ammunition. So he wasn't really on horseback. He was just sort of hanging on for dear life, as you can see there, and kind of hiding himself the best he could as the shells went off all around him. So yeah, the caption says Monterey, Lieutenant Grant goes for ammunition. So yeah, he came out of that war, which he hated, as a hero. Next slide. Here he is some more commenting on the annexation, the theft, as he saw it, of Texas. And Grant said that Texas was originally a state that belonged to the Republic of Mexico. There weren't very many people living there, but it became more populated as Americans began to settle there. They had received permission, authority, to colonize that area from Mexico. Next slide. But they broke a lot of rules in Texas. For example, rules regarding slavery. So this helps us with the question of the relationship of white settlement and slavery to the Mexican-U.S. War. And Grant said that the American colonists in Texas, they didn't pay enough attention to the supreme government of Mexico. They introduced slavery into Texas against the Constitution of Mexico. The Constitution of Mexico did not, nor does it now, sanction that institution. So they were breaking the law in Texas by introducing slavery into that area, according to Grant. Next slide. All right, so a lot of words here. I'll summarize these as much as I can. Again, this is Grant explaining the annexation of Texas and why it was bad. Mentions that the Americans in Texas set up an independent government of their own, and war existed between Texas and Mexico in name from that time until 1836. Okay, so this is kind of complicated here, but this is before the U.S. war with Mexico. This was a war between Texas, the Americans in Texas, and Mexico. And this would have involved the Battle of the Alamo, right? Okay. So active hostilities ceased upon the capture of Santa Anna, the Mexican president. Before long, however, the same people who, with permission of Mexico, had colonized Texas and afterwards set up slavery there, and then seceded as soon as they felt strong enough to do so, offered themselves and the state to the United States, and in 1845, their offer was accepted. So in 1845, the annexation of Texas by the United States was complete. It became a U.S. state, and as Grant analyzes it in his memoir, this was carried out in an unjust way, and that it was serving the sectional interests of the southern states because slavery was expanded along with U.S. territory. All right, let's take a deep breath. And I hope that I've helped answer the student question with what I've been giving you. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Let's give a little attention to some other opposing voices regarding the Mexican War. one of those belonged to Frederick Douglass. We've had a lot of attention to him in this class. An opponent of slavery, a former enslaved person himself. He spoke out forcefully against the U.S. war with Mexico. And that's an understatement. He was very angry about that war. And he called it a murderous war against the free states, against freedom, against the Negro, and against the interests of working men of this country, a means of extending that great evil and damning curse, Negro slavery. So Douglass was speaking out in favor of the North here and against Southern sectionalism. He went on to say, and gets even stronger here, Douglass said that I would not care if tomorrow I should hear of the death of every man who engaged in that bloody war in Mexico, and that every man had met the fate he went there to perpetrate upon unoffending Mexicans. So Douglass is holding U.S. forces collectively responsible for this, and condemning them in very harsh terms, obviously. Did not hold back. We'll go to the next slide. All right, a couple of other very prominent opponents of the U.S. war in Mexico. One of them on the left there, the American philosopher Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden and wrote Civil Disobedience. He was a major influence on Mahatma Gandhi in India and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States. And also, of course, future President Abraham Lincoln spoke out against the U.S. war with Mexico. Okay? All right, so I believe that is the last slide I have in this lecture. It is, okay? But I also want to, if you can hang on for just a second, I want to share something on the internet with you. So let me pause the sharing for just a minute there. Sorry. Recording now. And I'm going to share the screen with you again. And let me a little bit of information on.
It's 9 o'clock.
Yes, it is. That was my, sorry about that. That was an audio notification I get to keep myself on task here. Yes, it is 9 o'clock here in Casper, Wyoming, that is. Hope your weather's good in Lawrence there. It's pretty nice here after our historic blizzard last week. Okay. So this is a website from the Smithsonian Magazine of the Smithsonian Institution. And it is it's much more than a footnote to the U.S. war with Mexico. It gives some fascinating insight on the role of religious and ethnic identity and that war, okay? So it covers the phenomenon of how some Irish Americans fought for Mexico in what was called the St. Patrick's Battalion during the Mexican American War. And as the subtitle here says, anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States gave men like John Riley little reason to pay allegiance to the Stars and Stripes. Okay, yes, and I've mentioned this in the past that for a significant period in the history of the United States, it was often dangerous to be a member of the Catholic faith. That, Protestants, for various reasons, were extremely prejudiced against Catholic people. And the Ku Klux Klan, in addition to terrorizing Black people, and also they broadened their scope to go after Catholic people and to go after Jewish people and to go after communists and anarchists, etc. Okay, so the anti-Catholic sentiment in the 1800s became so extreme that, yes, some Irish Americans felt compelled to support Mexico during the war. And you have an image here. The main image that I'm showing here, it's a painting, not these advertisements on the right here. Try to ignore those if you can. But this image here, this painting, it's called The Hanging of the San Patricios, or that's Spanish for St. Patrick's, following the Battle of Chapultepec by Samuel E. Chamberlain. And the painting shows executions of these men, these Irish Americans who fought for Mexico after a battle in the Mexican-American War. Okay, so there are monuments to John Riley and the members of the St. Patrick's Battalion in Mexico. And it shows yet another example of opposition to U.S. involvement in that war within the United States. Okay. There was also opposition to Mexico's involvement in the war within Mexico. And I can share some of that with you next week. All right. But for now, this is the information I have for you today. And I will ask you if you have questions or comments. Let me look at the chat here. I don't see anything yet. Okay. Okay, going once, twice, 3 times. All right. Well, thank you so much for being a great audience. I see there's 21 people on the call today. That's a good turnout for Zoom. So yeah, thank you from the bottom of my heart and throughout my brain and my soul. So I wish you the best Thursday. Take care of yourselves. Be safe, be well, and have a great rest of the week and lovely weekend. Okay. Bye-bye.